Right. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to, I guess, what is now week 7 of the course. So we are very quickly speeding to the end of our time together. We have tonight's session, then we have another session next Monday on the 17th, and then our course officially ends then next week on, I believe it's the 21st. So we are almost there. Thank you again for your indulgence last week. Since I did not have internet connection, clearly I have it tonight, so we are good to go. I did put together that recording on the 4 models of effectiveness and provided that to you on our Canvas site. And I know everyone watched it because I read your Canvas posts, and your Canvas posts demonstrate that you had a good, clear understanding of all 4 of those models of effectiveness. So thank you very much for that. Um, Tonight, I think what we'll do is just start off very briefly with the recap of those 4 models of effectiveness. I think we dispense with that very quickly because, again, everyone did a nice job on the Canvas essay. Then the primary topic for tonight will be motivation, and we'll talk about some models of motivation. We'll talk about content models versus process models. Do that in the first part of class tonight. Do a breakout group to finish up the night if we have time remaining. And then when we get together next week for our final Zoom session, we'll briefly look at leadership and its impact upon effectiveness, knowing that you've covered leadership and other aspects of the program before, and then do a course wrap up next week as well. And then that will be it. So one more Zoom session after tonight. So in that recording that I posted for you in our Canvas site last week, I discussed the 4 different models of effectiveness: the goal attainment model, the systems resource model, the participant satisfaction model, and the internal process model, with the caveat that they're not mutually exclusive and that those models can overlap with each other. And I saw that frequently in a lot of the Canvas essays for last week, a lot of folks talking about how their organization utilized more than one of those models of effectiveness. But the goal attainment model, again, is the most common one. It's that linear type of model, looking at how well we are progressing toward the accomplishment of our goals, making the assumption that we have goals and that those goals can be defined and those goals can be measured. That goal attainment model, again, is more oriented around the control aspect of measuring effectiveness. Then we also discussed the second model of effectiveness, the systems resource model. Effectiveness measured as the ability or the effectiveness of the organization in acquiring surplus resources from its environment. Those surplus resources being all those things we talked about in open systems theory, whether they be ample labor force, money in terms of appropriations, political support from both elected officials as well as client groups, constituents. So that's our systems resource. You're effective if you're pulling in these surplus resources from the environment to help your organization survive into the future. We presented a third model of effectiveness, participant satisfaction, looking at the satisfaction of key constituencies, key stakeholders. And it's the participant satisfaction model that can both bleed over into the external as well as the internal environment. And so we said with the participant satisfaction model, when we're looking at external stakeholders outside the organization, then we're kind of bleeding over into that systems resource model of effectiveness because those folks are outside of that organization. When we're talking about the constituents within the organization, we're usually talking about our employees. And so that's kind of more a human relations, human resource management approach to dealing with those constituents, those stakeholders within our organization, and keeping those folks satisfied. And that's what we'll talk more about tonight when we talk about how you motivate those internal constituents. Then we offer a fourth model, and that fourth model is the internal process model, looking at how we do the work on a daily basis within the walls of the organization. Again, that bleeds over a little bit into the human relations type of approach as well, because we're trying to build a cohesive type of workforce. We're trying to build a workforce built upon communication, built upon teamwork. And so you're going to have kind of that human relations aspect as you work on those internal processes. But in that internal process model, we're defining effectiveness as organizational harmony and how well all the parts and all the pieces of our organization are working together to accomplish eventually our goals and our objectives. So The importance, the big so what question, obviously, is that it's important that there's just not one way to measure effectiveness. It's just not how well we achieved our goals. We can also look at the resources we're acquiring from our environment. We can look at how satisfied our external and internal constituents are. We can look at the processes that are going on within our organization, the everyday process of doing work. There are lots of ways in which we can measure effectiveness. And so again, it's going to depend upon your organization, how your organization defines and measures effectiveness. And quite likely, it's very likely that your organization is probably going to utilize multiple of those different models. So looking more at the internal process, looking more internal to the organization, we know that effectiveness is going to be predicated upon performance and productivity of our employees. And we know that the performance and productivity of our employees will be predicated upon their motivation. And so it's important to be effective as a public organization to adequately motivate our employees in order to be all that they can be and to do their jobs as well as they can to eventually help us achieve our goals and our objectives. So our purpose tonight is to talk about motivation in public organizations and to talk about some of the different motivational theories, content and process-oriented motivational theories, many of which you've already talked about before in other courses. But again, our purpose tonight is to talk about those models and theories with an eye on what they mean for the effectiveness of the organization. Then your Canvas essay that's due next week, you'll be using this information to identify what motivation models you see used in your organization and how those motivational models contribute to or detract from organizational effectiveness. So again, if we have time at the end of class tonight, which I think we probably will, we'll go ahead and we'll do our breakout groups, and you'll kind of do the same thing that you'll be doing for your Canvas essay, just kind of bouncing ideas off of each other in terms of the motivational models that you see in your organizations. So without further ado, let's jump into motivation, and we'll talk about some of these theories. We know that motivation is very much of a fundamental topic in the social sciences. We know there's not really a science of motivation. Motivation is more of a craft than it really is a science, meaning that the literature tells us that there are certain techniques and there are ideas and there are insights that we can glean from the literature to help us better motivate our employees, but there's not a science of motivation that you can then take in a one-size-fits-all approach and apply to every single organization. The motivational techniques and the motivational strategies that you will use will depend upon, obviously, you as a leader manager, the employees that you are trying to motivate, their individual valence levels, the values that they place upon certain types of incentives, the mixture of incentives that are available to you to use in motivating your employees, the culture of the organization. So there are a lot of contingency types of factors that will help dictate what types of motivational techniques are most appropriate for your given organization. But if your organization is a public organization, as we know, those public organizations have a lot of constraints that sometimes will make it difficult to motivate employees. Constraints in terms of the types of incentives, how many incentives we can use. All those types of things really are constraints placed upon our ability to motivate our employees in the public sector. But motivation is still a major topic in the public administration literature, because what we hope to do is motivate our employees while helping develop them as human resources, a la Elton Mayo, Abraham Maslow, a Douglas McGregor, and some of those HR and human resource management theorists. So let's talk a bit about motivation in public organizations and how it differs from motivating employees in private organizations. Again, a lot of constraints in the public sector. We have a lot of complexity, very complex structures in our public organizations. We have career civil service requirements. We have collective bargaining agreements through unionization. We have inherent limitations placed upon our incentives we can use in the public sector. As we've said many times, we have goal ambiguity, so our goals are oftentimes difficult to discover and difficult to measure with empirical measurements. We know that we have unstable and ambiguous expectations in terms of the performance of our employees. And oftentimes measuring the performance of our employees will be dictated by collective bargaining agreements and unionization. Sometimes we lack some cohesion among our employees and among the work groups within our public organizations. And as we all know, as public administrators, we are working in an environment where there's a very negative view of the quote unquote bureaucracy. When we use the word bureaucracy, that word bureaucracy usually comes with some very negative connotations. People hear bureaucracy, they think gridlock, they think impersonal, they think inefficient, they think ineffective. And it's very rare for us to actually have a positive adjective that members of the public use when they're talking about the bureaucracy. Charles Goodsell articulated this very well way back in 1970 in his Case for the Bureaucracy, where he talked about how people have a negative view of the bureaucracy predicated upon their last interaction with the bureaucratic organization. They could have 100 interactions with a quote unquote bureaucracy. 99 of those interactions could be positive. If that last interaction is negative, it could then color their perspective of what they think about the bureaucracy. It's kind of that recency effect that we know in social science research, that it's the most recent experience that then affects your entire perception about whatever you are interacting with. So that's why Charles Goodsell in his book tells us that as public administrators, we need to be kind of proactive salespeople for the public sector. We need to be proactive in showing the public just how much their everyday lives are affected by decisions made within public organizations. But when you're working with this negative view of the bureaucracy among members of the public, that can have an impact upon the motivation of public administrators. If you're always hearing about how your organization's ineffective and inefficient and how you're always tied up in red tape and gridlock, it's going to be tough to be motivated when you're always hearing all these negative depictions of the bureaucracy and your public organization. Well, let's get a basic definition of motivation. I think we all know what motivation is. I'm sure you've covered motivation theories before here in this program, but essentially motivation refers to a person's desire to work hard and work well and exert that effort on a consistent basis. So it's not just a transient, they work hard one day and then they don't work hard for the rest of the month. Motivation is a person's desire to work hard and work well in an ongoing pattern on a consistent basis. And so what we're trying to do as leaders and managers is obviously to promote that desire to work hard and work well on a consistent ongoing basis. So how do we measure motivation? Well, obviously, if we're talking about the motivational levels of individual employees, we will acquire information directly from those individual employees. So if you want to know how motivated an employee is, you will have to ask that employee. So we get a lot of our data on employee motivation primarily through the use of surveys and the use of questionnaires. So a kind of classic social science way of collecting data. So some examples of ways in which we can measure motivation that Rainey points us toward. One way in which we typically measure motivation is with a job motivation scale. And we'll ask questions such as, on most days on your job, how often does time seem to drag for you? Some people are completely involved in their jobs. They're absorbed in it day and night. For other people, the job is simply one of several interests. How involved do you feel in your job? How often do you do some extra work for your job that really isn't required of you? Would you say that you work harder, less hard, or about the same as other people doing your type of work in this organization? Again, some measurements of worker motivation. Another approach that's oftentimes used is right to work motivation scale. In the work motivation scale, you'll have statements such as, I put forth my best effort to get the job done regardless of difficulties. And then you'll have your typical Likert ordinal response scale, strongly agree, agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, and strongly disagree. I'm willing to start work early and stay late to finish a job. Same type of Likert scale. The next one is a reversed one. It has been hard for me to get very involved in my current job. Obviously, motivation will be measured with a strongly disagree or a disagree as opposed to strongly agree or agree. As you know, in social science research, we like to reverse our indicators a bit. And that's a way to check for measurement error and measurement bias. Because sometimes people will do what's called the halo effect, and they'll just follow right down all the strongly agrees or do all the strongly disagrees. This is a way in which you can have a check on that. I do extra work for my job that's not expected of me. Time seems to drag while I'm on the job, another reverse type of item, looking for the strongly disagrees or the disagrees as indicators of motivation. Intrinsic motivation scale of Lawler and Hall. When I do my work well, it gives me a feeling of accomplishment. When I perform my job well, it contributes to my personal growth and development. I feel a great sense of personal satisfaction when I do my job well. Doing my job well increases my self-esteem. Again, as we've talked about many times, we've talked about before in the program, in the public sector, the motivators tend to be more intrinsic as opposed to the extrinsic motivators that you oftentimes see in the private sector. We are very limited in the extrinsic motivators that we can use, so therefore we rely more on those intrinsic motivators, the self-actualization, the feeling of accomplishment that people get from doing their job well. Reward expectancies from Rainey himself. Producing a high quality of work increases my chances for higher pay. Producing a high quality of work increases my chances for a promotion. So do they actually expect to get these rewards from higher levels of performance and productivity? If you took a look at that study of federal employee engagement that I provided on our Canvas site, one of the things you probably noticed there is that when it comes to reward expectancies, that's where federal employees score the lowest, in that they oftentimes don't feel they're getting the rewards that they should get, or that well-performing employees are getting the rewards and that poor performing employees are not getting the rewards. And so this is kind of where we fall down a bit in terms of federal employee engagement. Peer evaluations, having peers evaluate the work motivation of other employees, having peers evaluate things such as an individual's team attitude, task concentration, their independence and ability to be a self-starter, their organizational identification, how closely they identify to the organization and its goals and mission, their job curiosity, persistence, professional identification, all ways in which we can measure the motivation of colleagues within our organization. So kind of, the similar type of thing you get with a 360 type of evaluation using peers to assess the motivation of their colleagues. But again, the problem is we are measuring perceptions of motivation. This is all about perceptions of motivation. Whenever you use surveys, whenever you use questionnaires, you're measuring perceptions. From social science research courses that can be somewhat subjective. There can be some measurement error and measurement bias in terms of the way in which we write our items on our surveys and our questionnaires. So it can become somewhat difficult for us to get true, accurate indicators of the motivation of our employees. Now, speaking of that federal employee engagement survey that I provided to you on our site, let me go ahead and I think I have it here for you to share out. And we're not going to go through it all because, again, it's a relatively lengthy document. But if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, it's interesting in that it gives us an example of how we use these types of questionnaires and surveys at the federal level to measure employee motivation and employee engagement. And we won't go through their entire methodology. You can read through the study on your own. But one of the highlights, I think, of the study that really gives us a nice synopsis of what they found is what I'm showing you on the screen right now. Some of the items in the survey that had the highest and the lowest levels of agreement. And so some of the items on the survey that federal employees agreed the most strongly with and disagreed the most strongly with. So on the left side, you see the highest percentage level of agreement among federal employees. I know how my work relates to agency goals. 87% of respondents in the federal bureaucracy agreed with that. That's obviously a very good sign, especially for something like a goal attainment model of effectiveness. that people know how their work is relating to the goals of the organization. 87% also agree with my supervisor treats me with respect. Again, kind of that HRM type of model. 85%, my supervisor supports my need to balance work and other life issues. Again, a human resource management type of an approach. And so that's very encouraging. 84% agree with the people I work with cooperate to get the job done. 83%, I know what's expected of me on the job. 83%, my supervisor listens to what I have to say. 82%, my work unit has the job relevant knowledge and skills necessary to accomplish goals. That kind of gets at expectancy theory, that the unit and the people in the unit have the requisite skills in order to achieve levels of performance that they want to achieve. My agency is successful at accomplishing its mission. My supervisor is committed to a workforce representative of all segments of society, representative bureaucracy. Supervisors in my work unit support employee development, again, HRM. Overall, how good of a job do you feel is being done by your immediate supervisor? 78% with the highest level of ranking. So those are the items that federal employees tend to be relatively satisfied with. The bad news is on the right side in that column, the lowest percentage level of agreement. You'll see the lowest level of percentage of agreement was 42% that agreed that in my work unit, steps are taken to deal with a poor performer who cannot or will not improve. So poor performance is not being dealt with in organizations. 43%, I believe the results of the survey will be used to make my agency a better place. So not many of them actually believe that the survey is going to be used to be helpful to the organization. So that's a problem. 51%, my work unit differences in performance are recognized in a meaningful way. Again, we're not really seeing those reward expectancies that are really panning out for these employees. In my organization, senior leaders generate high levels of motivation and commitment, only 51%. So they don't feel that leaders and supervisors are doing a good job of motivating the workforce. We start to get a little bit more positive there. 58%, how satisfied are you with involvement in decisions that affect your work? Let's start to get a little bit better. How satisfied are you with the information received from management on what's going on in your organization, communication, obviously, and so on and so on. So you can see that for the most part, people feel like they know their organization's goals, they know their role in the organization, they feel like they're being treated with respect. On the downside, though, they don't really feel those reward expectancies are being met, and that poor performance is being penalized and good performance is being rewarded. So when it really comes to the allocation of incentives, it seems like that's where we're running into trouble, at least at the federal level, in terms of federal employee engagement and motivation. There also tends to be a strong relationship between employee motivation and engagement and the size of the organization. In that smaller organizations oftentimes tend to have more engaged and more motivated employees, as opposed to the very large types of organizations, which again makes sense in that when you've got a very small organization, you probably have a much flatter hierarchy. And the much flatter hierarchy oftentimes then contributes to kind of a Mary Parker Follett democratic organization type of an approach, where people feel that they can participate, that they're involved in decision making, and that is then an inherent motivator for those employees. Very large organizations, they're oftentimes more of a tall hierarchy, much more regimented in their organizational structure, much more difficult to motivate people through self-governance in a very large organization. But it really is a fascinating study, and if you go through it, you can really glean a lot of information about the motivation level of federal employees. I like to include it here just because it gives you an example of how the federal government's going out there and trying to measure engagement and motivation among its employees. It's that big of a deal, but the federal government puts all this work, all this time and effort into trying to measure motivation, and they've been doing it for many, many years. I think the one I have up here is the 2020 version. Every year a new version comes out. There's a 2021 version, and so they update it every year. One of the trends that we have seen over the years is that federal employee engagement and motivation has incrementally increased with each passing year. So the good news is that engagement motivation tends to be going up, but it's going up at a very incremental type of pace. So it's a very small increase, but it's an increase nonetheless. Again, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time going through this because you can read through it on your own and kind of get a sense of employee motivation and engagement and how we try and measure it at the federal level. So let me go back here and we'll start up our slides again. Okay. So motivation is obviously a very important part of performance, but it's not the only reason for increased levels of performance. You know, it's kind of one of those things where it's necessary but not sufficient. You've heard the necessary but not sufficient argument before. Motivation is a necessary component for performance, but it is not a sole sufficient dictator of performance. We know that other things will enhance performance, the ability level of the employee, their training and development, their preparation in terms of their skills to do the job, their perceptions about their efficacy, their ability to perform the job at the level they want to perform the job. So motivation is just one aspect of helping to predict the performance and productivity of employees. But that's the one that we are focusing on here tonight. So as we talk about some of the theories of motivation, many of these we've run into before in this class. And if you haven't seen them, if you didn't see them before you came into this class, we covered them in this class. You probably covered them in previous courses too. So they're going to be very familiar to you. But what we will do is we'll take the motivation theories and we'll divide them up into two different categories: the content-based theories and the process-oriented theories. So a content theory of motivation is concerned with analyzing the needs and the motives and the rewards that affect motivation for those individual employees. So kind of like an Abraham Maslow type of an approach. That's a content-oriented type of an approach. The process-oriented theories look at the psychological and behavioral processes behind motivation. So that's where we look more at things such as the use of consequences to motivate employees. How employees learn, how they develop through learning. So it's more process-oriented in nature. So we're going to look at 4 content-oriented theories and 4 process-oriented theories. These 8 theories we look at are certainly not the universe of all of the motivational theories that we could talk about, but these are kind of the primary theories that the literature covers when talking about motivation of public employees. So the 4 content-oriented theories are Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, which you've already covered; Douglas McGregor, his theory X and theory Y, which you've already covered; Herzberg's 2-factor theory, which you probably covered in an HR class or a previous course in the program; and McClelland's needs-based model, which I'm assuming you probably covered before, but if not, we will cover it tonight. So those are our 4 content-oriented theories. Maslow, you're very familiar with. We covered it, the hierarchy of needs. We know that each one of these needs serves as a motivator, and the bottom 4 needs serve as a motivator to try and fulfill a deficiency. So people are motivated by deficiencies in psychological needs. Uh-oh. There's a problem here. It looks like my meeting is ending for some reason. I don't know. That's very strange. Okay. I don't know why, but I just got to notice the meeting ends in 10 minutes, and that's not the way it's supposed to work. So let's go ahead and spend those 10 minutes covering this as quickly as we can, and then we'll see what happens. Very strange. Anyway, so we know that the bottom ones are deficiency oriented. So you're motivated by trying to fulfill a deficiency. We know self-actualization is growth motivated. You're motivated by the desire to grow. But this hierarchy of needs of Maslow gives us this rationale for what motivates our employees. We know McGregor's theory X and theory Y, again, gives us some information about motivation. We know that theory Y employees are motivated kind of a la this Chris Argyris and the desire for personal growth. They are very intelligent, they're very creative, they seek out responsibility, but they are shoehorned into theory X organizations. And so if a theory X organization needs to modify itself into a theory Y organization in order to motivate those theory Y employees. And the theory Y employees are going to be motivated by their intrinsic types of rewards as opposed to their extrinsic rewards. Then there's Frederick Herzberg and the two-factor theory. There are motivators and there are hygiene factors. People are only motivated by the motivational factors. Hygiene factors will not motivate employees. Hygiene factors such as the condition of work, the external, extrinsic types of rewards, those things will only prevent dissatisfaction. It's really the motivators such as interest in work, desire for achievement, those higher order needs. Those are what will motivate employees. So hygiene only prevents dissatisfaction. Motivators will then increase motivation. Then there's McClellan and the needs-based model, another content-oriented model. McClellan identifies for us 3 different types of motivators: achievement, authority, and affiliation motivation. Achievement motivation, obviously, it's that self-actualization, be all you can be, from Abraham Maslow. Authority, power motivation is primarily for leaders. You're motivated by the ability to coalesce your power. Affiliation motivation, this is kind of the belonging, the social needs that Elton Mayo talked about, Abraham Maslow talked about with his middle of his hierarchy of needs. The primary focus for McClellan to motivate employees is the achievement motivation. And he refers to this achievement motivation as a dynamic restlessness to try and achieve mastery over one's environment through success at achieving goals by using one's own cunning, ability, and effort. Essentially, you try to achieve mastery over your universe, mastery over your environment. That's kind of this ongoing type of personal growth type of achievement. Again, that's self-actualization apex on the Abraham Maslow hierarchy of needs. So those are 4 different content-oriented types of theories. How they compare to each other, you can see on this chart. For Maslow, McGregor, Herzberg, and McClellan, the bottom level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs are associated with McGregor's theory X, associated with Herzberg hygiene factors, and McClellan's power and affiliation motivators. The self-actualization of Maslow is similar to the theory Y of McGregor, similar to the motivators that Herzberg tells us about, and similar to McClellan's achievement motivation. So this is kind of how those 4 content-oriented theories relate to each other. Adams also contributes to this discussion by telling us that there are inputs and outputs. And so employees will think about how much they're putting into the organization, how much they're putting into their job, relative to how much they're getting out of that job. And so if there's an imbalance between inputs and outputs, obviously you're going to have a lack of motivation. They expect to at least get as much out of their job as they're putting in. If you want them to be motivated, hopefully they get more out of their job than what they are contributing to their position. And that's this Adams equity type of theory. Speaking of equity, we also know that to motivate employees, employees must feel that they're being treated equitably, that there's both what's called distributive justice and procedural justice. Distributive justice speaks to fairness and equity and how rewards are being distributed to employees. Procedural justice speaks to the processes that are being used in the decision-making about who gets what rewards and how much one person gets compared to how much another person gets. Higher levels of feelings of distributive and procedural justice are strongly correlated with positive work-related attitudes, which are then positively correlated with higher levels of motivation. Then our second set of theories, the process-oriented theories, are theories such as Vroom's expectancy theory, Skinner's operant conditioning, Bandura's social learning, and Locke's goal-setting theory. You've probably run into Vroom's expectancy theory before, but in Vroom's expectancy theory, employees go through, if not a formal calculation, an informal calculation of the likelihood that they put in a certain amount of effort and that will result in a certain level of productivity. And then the likelihood that if they achieve that level of productivity, that some type of an outcome will then be given to them, and then they place a value upon that outcome. It's all based upon this idea of employees acting as rational, self-interested actors, where they want to maximize their benefits and minimize their costs. So in Vroom's expectancy theory, there are three basic concepts: valence, expectancy, and instrumentality. Valence speaks to the value that employees place upon rewards or outcomes that they get from achieving a certain performance level. So how important is additional pay or more flexibility or a more challenging type of position? How much value do they place on these potential outcomes? Then there is expectancy. Expectancy says that employees have different expectations of their own ability. So how confident are they that if they put forth this effort, they will be able to achieve the performance level they want to achieve? And then instrumentality refers to the perception that employees will get what they're promised, that leaders and managers will actually give the reward to the employees that they have promised to those employees. So the basic formula is motivation effort is a function of the likelihood that a certain level of effort will lead to a certain level of performance. How confident they are that if they come in on a Saturday, they will get this report done. Multiply times the likelihood that this level of performance will lead to an outcome. So you get this report done, you will then be considered to be employee of the month. So what's the likelihood that's going to happen? That's your instrumentality. And then the valence, the V, is the value they place upon that outcome, the value they place upon becoming employee of the month. So what it means for managers is that we need to understand what our employees value. We need to understand the valence levels that they place upon all these different potential outcomes. Expectancy. It means that we need to know the confidence of our employees, that if they put forth a certain amount of effort, that they will end up achieving this level of performance or productivity. And instrumentality, which means that leaders and managers must come through on their promises. That if they promise something to their employees, they must make good on that promise. So that's expectancy theory of Vroom. I like expectancy theory a lot, but again, I don't think a lot of employees will go through those calculations. I don't think employees actually go through calculations of percentages, but what they will do is in a more informal nature, they will consider how likely it is that if I put forth this effort, we're going to get this result, and that this result will then give me this outcome, whether it be higher pay or more time off or more flex time, and then what value I place upon all those potential outcomes. And I don't know, there's apparently some issue with the Zoom system tonight because it's telling me that we're not on Zoom Pro and that the session is ending in less than a minute. And I don't really understand why, because it's the same session that we've been using all term long. So I think there's something going on with Zoom. So just very quickly, if this session ends, I'm going to create another session. I'll send you an email with that new link, and then we'll just log in through that new link in case this session ends like it says it's going to end. So let's see what happens. It's kind of like, waiting for the year 2000 and just thinking something bad's going to happen, and then it never really happened. But